asked ChatGPT, what is the source code for a human being? And predictably I got back, the source code for a human being in a biological sense is the DNA found in the nucleus of our cells. Our genes define us in many ways, but to what degree do they define our behavior? Or if not our behavior, humans' behavior? No, in today's interview we focus on what we can learn from studying dog breeds. The history of dog breeding gives geneticists a unique opportunity to study things, and modern science has quite a bit to offer to that process as well. All that and more right after this. Look everybody, data science has been reshaping every industry, and that's not slowing down. All this AI stuff is just going to accelerate it. So whether you want to advance or pivot your career, you should consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business and their 100% online Business Analytics Graduate Certificate program. It'll teach you how to analyze and interpret data. The skills you learn will allow you to succeed anywhere. This online program consists of 4 courses: Business Analytics for Managers, Machine Learning for Business, Business Data Preparation and Visualization, and Analysis of Unstructured Data. It's a flexible program. You can go at your own pace. Those of you who want to hit the gas hard can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate is designed for professionals in any industry who want to become data-savvy leaders or pivot into analytics. It can also be your gateway into a Georgia Tech MBA. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Get the skills necessary to do that. Applications for the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business Business Analytics Graduate Certificate are open now for fall 2024. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more. And don't forget to apply before May 1st. That's the deadline. For more information, head over to techgradcertificates.com.
Jessica Hekman. I have a surprising number of affiliations. My main affiliation right now is the Functional Dog Collaborative, which is a nonprofit that I founded, which I'm happy to answer more questions about. I also teach behavioral biology online for a master's program at Virginia Tech. And I do a little bit of consulting and research work with Hecht Lab at Harvard University.
What is the Functional Dog Collaborative?
So I founded that when COVID first hit and I suddenly had a lot of time on my hands that I used to be commuting. Its mission is to try to rewrite the narrative around where dogs come from in the United States and in the world. It's international, but because I'm US based, that's how I think of it mostly. So right now it's a wonderful thing that there are fewer and fewer unintentional litters going to shelters. So shelters are an important place for where dogs are rehomed, but they're not really where dogs come from. Where do dogs actually come from? And the answer is a tiny percentage of them come from breeders who are really putting their blood, sweat, and tears into it. And a much larger percentage come from either people who are sort of very casually breeding, sort of don't know what they don't know, and maybe not doing everything right. And then another large percentage from high volume commercial kennel-based breeders. And I deeply believe that it's very important, and there's evidence to support this, that it's very important for a puppy to be in a home for those first few weeks. So I don't think that kennel-based breeding is the best way to create behaviorally resilient puppies. And then even the breeders who are putting blood, sweat, and tears into it, a lot of them are still very much in the box of breeding the way we have been breeding purebred dogs for 150 years, but we're now having these consequences of lack of genetic diversity, which means that a lot of breeds come with these baked in problems of very high risk of cancer, heart disease, epilepsy, other hard to track down diseases like that. So what can we do to change that whole narrative? So the Functional Dog Collaborative provides a podcast where we dig into it. There's a very large and vibrant Facebook group, and we're pushing out other information on social media and have other projects that I am working on sort of more behind the scenes.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, there's no dog census, so maybe my question's unfair, but do we have a sense, are dogs born in the wild, or is this really a human-driven activity?
It's really a human-driven activity. It's interesting how the populations of dogs and cats are very different in this country, in the sense that cats are much more able to live outside of human homes. And even cats who do attach themselves to humans sometimes are living outside a lot, and you come to find out when you put a tracking collar on them, perhaps they're actually getting fed and maybe even getting medical care from multiple homes.
Uh-huh.
Whereas dogs, certainly these days, I mean, it was a bit different in the 1950s and earlier, but these days, very much dogs are in homes. And even if they're outside a fair amount of the day, they're very much attached to a particular home. So, when a dog has a litter, you can pretty much always say this is the person who really should be responsible for that. There's always that attachment, whether there was an intentional breeding or not. But they are very much part of our lives and not just out there. That's a United States thing, right? That's a first world country thing. So there's certainly plenty of countries in the world where that's not true, but for where I live, it's very much true.
So we have this challenge you mentioned of health-related issues that are correlated with breeds. The breeding is a very human activity. I'm going to ask you the big question, how do we fix it?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things I keep saying is that this is not a scientific problem, it's a social problem. We know scientifically how to fix the problem. Socially, we have some institutions that have been in place for 100, 150 years that are very important to a lot of people and that do provide very important structure and support in a lot of parts of producing dogs with good welfare, with good health within that box, right? And so we've started to come to say, like, you can breed a golden retriever to be very healthy in X, Y, and Z way, but they are always going to have increased risk of cancer's the big one for Goldens, allergies, epilepsy, and that's just how the breed is now. So how do you fix that? In the case of purebred populations where there is an increased risk of some particular trait that's specific to the breed, that means that that's genetically based. And so there is a genetic fix for it. Unfortunately, what that often means is that you have to bring in some new genetic diversity from outside of that breed. We don't have good structures for doing that, right? So a lot of people have emotional resistance to it, but even if the emotional resistance went away, it's very clear how to breed a golden retriever. You find two dogs who are registered as golden retrievers, which means that we know that they've been golden retrievers all the way back in their ancestry to when there was the first golden retrievers, and you breed them together and you register the puppies. If you want to start thinking about, well, what if we bring in something else? There's not a set way of doing that. A lot of people are trying to figure it out. What do you bring in? How often do you bring it in? One dog isn't going to do it. How do you make sure you're not introducing new diseases? That's something a lot of people are concerned about. I'm happy to talk about how it's again, a scientifically solved problem, socially not so solved. So that's what we're grappling with right now.
Well, I know the science of genetics has gotten pretty advanced, but it's also not deterministic. So especially with the risk of introducing a new disease, how do you wisely go into, merging science with breeding?
Breeding is an art in a lot of ways. There's a couple different ways of looking at genetics based on the number of genes involved. So there are some cases where this is typically when we're talking about diseases rather than behavior, where a single gene will control the likelihood of whether the dog is going to get the disease or not. And in that case, it's typically very much, if you have the variant, you're almost certainly going to get to the disease generally. And so in those cases, most of those have been found and you can do a genetic test. If you can't do the genetic test in the cases where there's still some that haven't been found in certain populations, you can look at the pedigree. And if it's clearly reported which dogs in the pedigree had the disease, you can track and understand the inheritance patterns and predict whether the dog is at risk. Much more difficult, and what geneticists are grappling with these days, are the diseases that are controlled by many, many genes, each with a small amount of risk contribution, plus generally some amount of environment influence. So that would tend to be something like cancer. So you can be born with an increased risk of getting a particular cancer, and that would be not just one gene, but a whole bunch of genes conferring that risk together. But you would also have some amount of environmental influence which from our perspective sometimes just looks like chance, right? Like, why is it that a dog with a certain amount of risk sometimes will get it and sometimes not? And we like to think that we can have some amount of control over how we feed them and, how much exercise they get. And of course that weighs into it. But if that were everything, we would have much more control over life. And wouldn't that be nice? So it turns out that when you're bringing a large amount of risk into a population with a large number of genes like that, the way that that risk gets fixed in the population. So I would say that the risk of certain kinds of cancers, lymphoma and hemangiosarcoma, is pretty fixed in golden retrievers. 70% of them are going to die of cancer. That tells you that there's a very high risk there already. In order for that to really be fixed in the population like that, there has to be a fair amount of genetic similarity among all the dogs. So if I were to breed in a dog that had itself a high risk of cancer or heart disease or epilepsy, so long as I didn't inbreed back to that particular dog, I wouldn't be introducing that risk into the population.
Is it likely that there's a laboratory solution in the near future, some sort of sci-fi CRISPR solution?
CRISPR can be useful for changing individual genes. Not so useful, at least not where we are with the technology right now, of changing a large number of genes. And we haven't, at this point, even successfully identified the genes for these diseases that are what I would call complex phenotypes that are based on a large number of genes. And there are certainly some cases we've identified some of the genes. So Dobermans are known to be at very high risk of heart disease. There have been 2 separate genetic variants that have been identified that do seem to confer some amount of risk, but there are a lot more that haven't been identified yet. It's probably the case that a lot of them are each a very small amount of risk.
Sure.
So in order for CRISPR to work, you'd have to first identify a significant proportion of them, which is already we haven't successfully done. And then secondly, we'd have to be able to CRISPR a large number of genes. That's not where that technology is at this point. So we're not close to a CRISPR solution right now. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen at some point in the future, but it's not on the horizon in any way.
Well, cases, some diseases are maybe a single gene, and then others are these complex interactions as you've described. Is it realistic to think we can attribute behavior to genetics?
Yeah, so and I think that's how you found me, is the one paper that I was second author on. Behavior absolutely has a genetic component. And again, the best test for answering the question, at least in dogs, of does this particular trait have a genetic component is to look and see, is the trait different in different populations? And we do perceive that behavior is different in different breeds of dogs. Retrievers like to retrieve on the whole. The other thing that you can ask yourself is this trait controlled by just 1 or 2 genes, which makes it much easier to actually control? Or is it controlled by a lot of genes plus environment? And so even looking at retrieving, where overwhelmingly Labrador retrievers do like to retrieve, not all of them like to retrieve. And there's quite a bit of variance in how much they enjoy retrieving. Even with Labrador retrievers, we haven't managed to completely fix the trait. It's not that 100% of them enjoy retrieving, which means that there's still a fair number of genes there and probably some influence of environment as well. So what we understand about the genetics of behavior tends to be that it's very much like the situation that I was just talking about with cancer and heart disease, that there are a whole lot of genes that affect it, and environment affects it very much too. So in the paper that I'm talking about, that I was second author on, we put some numbers on that, and it's hard to really understand what the numbers mean from a lay perspective. But I think a good way of talking about it is that genetics definitely has an effect on behavior, but it's a relatively small effect compared to environment, which was not actually a revolutionary finding. That's been known by behavioral geneticists, that you can affect a population's likelihood of having a particular behavioral trait, but that environment is still going to be in effect, and that you're going to have a lot less control over it than you'd really like to have.
Well, it's pointed out to me often that dogs are different breeds, not different species, compared to maybe birds that have a lot of speciation. Does that in somehow imply they're all closer together?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just on a journal club call a couple weeks ago where we were talking about exactly what a species is. And so let's start with that.
Sure.
What is a species and what is a breed? They're not as obvious. Those are some of the these are some of the definitions, sort of like pornography. I know it, I can point to it when I see it, but when you actually try to define it, it can be really hard. So what I learned in probably high school or even grade school was that a species is a population of organisms that interbreed with each other and produce fertile young. And they might be able to interbreed outside of the species, but the young will not be fertile. So that's a very clear cut definition, but it turns out not to be the definition that we actually work with in real life. Canids are a great example. Dogs are considered a subspecies of wolves. They're really the same species. They interbreed quite readily. They have quite fertile young when they do. The populations are mostly kept apart by humans, and not even so much that we're, forcing them apart, but the dogs prefer to live with us and wolves prefer not to live with us. They obviously look different. They obviously behave differently. Wolves do not make good pets. Dogs make great pets. Dogs don't do well out, running the plains, trying to bring down large game. That's a start. So then we bring in coyotes. Canis latrans, considered a different species than Canis lupus, which were dogs and wolves are both Canis lupus. But turns out that coyotes and wolves interbreed quite readily and produce fertile offspring as well. In fact, if you look at Western coyotes, those are pretty much pure coyote. They're very small. If you look at Eastern coyotes, they've mixed with wolves and they're larger. And you can look at their genetics and see that they're actually part wolf, however far back. Canis has a lot of this sort of intermixing, and it's very hard to say exactly what a species is, except for that you can point at a coyote versus a wolf and say they're clearly different things. When you start looking at some of these questions of how do you define a species, you can get some really interesting case studies. One great example is the term ring species, which I'm not an expert on, but I do know the story of a particular species of bird, which is a ring species around, I believe, the North Pole, where you started at one point and you have a population of birds and you start moving east or west and they will interbreed with other populations. But as you come all the way around, then when they meet again after you've completely circumnavigated the pole, the changes in the one direction have been so gradual, but by the time they meet again on the far side, they are now clearly different species and can't interbreed. But how do you draw that line? Because there's a line on one side, but the other direction, it's a smooth gradation. So species are already not as easy to define as we would like to think that they are. So then there's the question of breeds. Yes, breeds definitely more closely related than species. But again, what is a breed? Is it as a scientific concept? Is it a social concept? The concept of a breed, I think, often comes with the idea of a club or an organization that maintains a registry, and that the registry says the initial dogs that we recognize as part of this breed are these dogs. All the dogs that are part of this breed are descended from these initial dogs. And you can't bring in anything from outside of that initial population without the permission of the registry. Some registries will permit that. Some registries will not permit that. They're still breeds. Then you start talking about this concept of land races. When you go look, say, in Scotland, and you had what we refer to now as border collies who've been herding sheep for hundreds of years. For a long period of time, it was just the dogs that were better at herding sheep were bred together. Maybe there were some selections based on coat color. Maybe it was that they liked a thicker coat to keep them warmer. But that, was it a breed? There was not a formal organization. These days, there is a formal organization, multiple formal organizations that recognize border collies. There are also people who are still breeding them just based on performance. What is the true border collie? What is that actual breed? Is that initial landrace population different from the breed these days? So it's a really interesting set of concepts that are not as clearly delineated as we'd like to think.
Well, many breeds certainly have properties or behavioral stereotypes we carry about them. The retrieving of golden retrievers is maybe the greatest example. When you want to study the degree to which that's scientific versus sort of our perception on it, how do you get data to really do some good analysis?
That is something that we really struggled with in that paper. So one of the things that I think was revolutionary about that paper, two things actually. One is that we really looked at mutts for the first time. Pretty much all previous papers had really focused on individual breeds with the idea that how can you really characterize mutts? They're so different. But we had a very large sample size and we did have a large percentage of mutts enrolled. And then the other thing that we did that was different from other papers was that we connected the individual dog's behavior to the individual dog's genetics for 2,111 dogs, which is a very challenging thing to do, which is the reason that what had been the standard approach previously had been to take, for example, a population of golden retriever owner surveys to assess golden retriever behavior, and then separately go and find a bunch of golden retrievers that had been genotyped and sort of assume that the behaviors are pretty much the same between the one population where you had assessed the behavior and the separate population where you had assessed the genetics. And we actually looked at the individual dogs, their behavior, and their genetics. We looked at behavioral traits in particular breeds. And then we also looked at the same behavioral traits in mixed breed dogs who had some of that breed ancestry. And we took a look at, the expectation for a trait like that would be as a dog becomes less and less genetically golden retriever, you should be able to see the interest in retrieving decreasing. If it doesn't decrease at the rate that you expect, then there's something else going on. And that could be that owners are answering the questions differently. Because we'd ask something like, does your dog like retrieving objects? And it would be a statement. My dog likes retrieving objects. And so it would be strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, strongly agree. So are people falling out in a different place because they know they have a golden retriever, because they expect the dog to like to retrieve? And once they have a mutt, do they not have those expectations? Or is it that when you get a golden retriever, you get a golden retriever partly because you really want a dog who's going to play fetch with you? And so you really put a lot of work into this expectation of we're going to go to a park and play fetch and it's going to be awesome. And maybe with a mutt that happens to have some golden, you don't do that because that's not why you got them and you don't have that expectation. We did see that the correlation was not as tight as we would expect if it was a purely genetic answer to that question. Why? Don't know. That would be a follow-up paper.
Well, you'd mentioned that you can kind of analyze how distant, how less of a golden retriever are you? Do you lose the golden retriever-like properties? But what is your golden retriever measuring stick? How do you say the degree to which they are of the breed or not?
Oh, so you're asking the genetic question, not the behavioral question, right? You're asking, how do we know if it actually is a golden retriever and how much golden retriever is in it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
That's about assessing a dog's breed ancestry. There are a bunch of commercial packages out there that are widely used so that an owner who has a mutt and is curious about what's in there could take a saliva swab and send it in to one of a number of companies and find out. We had our own method of doing it, which was developed by Carlson Laboratory, the lab that put out this paper. I was not part of that actual work, but I was there observing it happen, so I can answer some questions about it. Kathleen Morrill was the graduate student who did this work, and she was really great at it. What you do is, first you send a saliva swab and you get the saliva back, and then you get some genetic information back about it, which I could go into all kinds of ludicrous details about, which I doubt anybody's really interested in that portion of it. Then you have to train the algorithm. And essentially what that means is you have some number of dogs. I think that we ended up saying at least 12 per breed. So we had to go out there and get samples from 12 per breed. At the time of the paper, we had 101 breeds. And so we had to trust that those dogs were of that breed. So we did things like at one point we were short on a couple breeds and I just took some swabs and went to a dog show and found dogs that were being shown in conformation at a dog show. And I trusted that they were of that breed, which I think was pretty reliable. And I would chase the people down when their dog came out of the ring and say, hey, can I swab your dog? So then once you have genetic information from those dogs, you put it into the algorithm and you say, these dogs are this breed, these other dogs are that breed. The algorithm then, when you send it something unknown, is able to say, well, this chunk of it comes from this breed, and this chunk over here comes from that breed. And it's able then to put those chunks together and say, okay, 12% this and 37% that. I actually genetically tested my dog, who is a rare breed. He is an English Shepherd. And we did not have English Shepherds in the database yet at the point that I genetically tested him. It came out saying that he was a mix of a bunch of breeds that I knew were closely related to English Shepherds. So it thought he was a rough-coated collie and an Australian Shepherd and maybe something else. I think there was some Sheltie in there too. And that was just it flailing and doing its best. So the algorithm is pretty terrible. It turns out it's saying, I see this is a purebred, but I don't know the breed. It will always assume that it actually has the answer. So there is some amount of us having to say, oh, I see what happened here. I'm trying to remember, it was Belgian Malinois, I think, that we didn't have. And it kept coming back as half German Shepherd, half something else. And we sort of learned to see those and be like, oh, that's actually a purebred Malinois. So there is that failure mode. But otherwise, it's actually pretty accurate, assuming you give it enough DNA markers. So some of the tests that are on the market right now don't give a large number of markers, and they can be not as accurate at predicting the breeds, but the tests that do have a larger number of DNA markers can be actually quite accurate.
When I think of certain dog behaviors, even though they might correlate with a breed, many of them feel a bit universal, like all dogs will fetch, or not all of them, but many dogs will fetch, right? So when then you get into the survey data, how pronounced are features, from across that scale you were describing? Is there everyone kind of hitting the middle ground a lot, or is there a lot of separation?
There was not a lot of separation. Analyzing the surveys was my job, and I really struggled with it because I kept feeling like there's probably a good way of characterizing. I started thinking of it as the fingerprint of a breed, that a particular breed is likely to be, higher likelihood here and higher likelihood there. It's not going to be 100% anywhere, but like if you could think of it as a line with some spikes, the spikes would be in particular places. But I had trouble finding a really good statistical test that assessed that, and I looked at a lot of them. The other thing that I found was that mostly people really like their dogs and think that their dogs are pretty good dogs. And so we had a lot of values clustering around the middle and just above the middle, where just above is the good side for whatever the trait is that you're talking about. We did not have so many extremes. So if you think about how I explained the scale, it's basically a 0 to 5 scale. And no one wanted to answer 0 or 5. Just sort of like when you go to the hospital and they say, how is your pain on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is the worst pain imaginable? No one answers 10 because you're like, well, no one's cutting my arm off right now. So how bad can it actually be? And similarly, I think with our dogs, no one wants to answer 0 or 5 because that's just so extreme. And so they really did cluster around the middle very much.
So then you've got a data set, if I understood correctly, of a little over 2,100 dogs, both the survey data and the genotyping together, not just two similar populations compared. What goes on next in terms of analysis?
The first thing that we did was put together factors. So we had, I think, 110 questions ended up getting into the study, to the actual published paper. And we grouped those using a statistical analysis into 8 factors, where a factor could have anywhere from like 5 to 20 questions that tended to be grouped together. And the computer algorithm was able to say, based on how people answer these questions, I can see that this set are related. And the question that we found some of the most interesting genetic information on was the question about human sociabilities. Does the dog like spending time around people? Which, just to give you a taste for one of the things that can mean, is my shy dog, Jenny, is actually very sociable. She really likes people. She likes being around people. People that she trusts, she really likes being petted. But she's also afraid of people, even though she likes them. And being afraid of people is sort of the separate question. So are they human sociable? So then we did this genome-wide association study, which is what the behavioral geneticists were the most excited about and felt like was the heart of the paper. So that's where you take the list of genetic markers that you got and you spread them out basically by where they are on each chromosome. And then for each marker, you ask the question, is, for example, the score of the dog on human sociability associated with what the marker looks like? So the marker is going to be, it's binary, right? Generally, it's either this allele or that allele. Then the computer goes and takes a look at, gosh, how many markers did we have for that? Over 1 million. So for each marker, it looks to see an association. For human sociability, we actually found some nice peaks of association where you could say somewhere in this region of the DNA, something is going on that seems to affect the likelihood of the dog being sociable to humans. This is genetics. This is behavioral genetics. So it was not like there's a switch here that either or, single gene, the dog's going to love or hate people. But there's something going on. And that was the strongest signal that we got, which for me is actually a pretty strong message that if we want to put the effort into breeding dogs that are sociable to humans, we should be able to have pretty good success at that if we do it right, because there is a strong genetic component to it, potentially.
I can get that we have a statistical connection, and we can say that we know there's something, as you said, going on in this region of DNA. Do you have any insight into the actual mechanism of how do these AGCs and Ts turn into that?
No, so this was a genome-wide association study, or GWAS, and GWAS gives you a region to look at. Then there would theoretically be a follow-up study where you start narrowing down the region and trying to figure out sort of exactly where what we would call the causative mutation is. So GWAS just says something in this region. That's it. The next step is to do follow-up studies where you drill down into that region and try to find what's the actual allele that's actually important. And then ideally, that would be in a gene. And you'd be able to look at the gene, and this never happens, right? Not in behavioral genetics. You'd be able to look at the gene and say, oh, I see this version of the allele makes a working protein, and that version of the allele makes a not working protein. And then you go figure out what the protein does in the brain, different parts of the brain potentially, right? So you can see that this is a long process. What generally ends up, in my experience, happening in behavioral genetics is that, first of all, it's very hard to drill down. But then if you start getting close and sort of making the region smaller and smaller, then it starts being like, well, there's some genes sort of near to here, but also there's just a lot of stuff in DNA that's not in genes that we don't really know what it does. We think it's regulatory, which is very typical in behavioral genetics, that what the actual mutation does is cause a gene somewhere else to be expressed more or less often, rather than what we really like to see is where it just breaks a protein. And then you're like, oh, that's very easy to characterize, right? But the regulatory stuff is harder, right? So then you're sort of like, oh, what is it regulating? We don't have really good technology for connecting a region to what it's regulating. So that's very hard. Even if we could figure out what it's regulating, it's sort of like, well, where is that happening? The brain is a very complex organ. It's really a lot of different organs smushed together. Is it affecting the hippocampus? Is it affecting the prefrontal cortex? Is it affecting the amygdala? You sort of have to guess and go take a look. And obviously doing brain studies in dogs is super challenging because we don't really like killing dogs and cutting their heads open to get their brains, right? So you have to try to figure out ways of doing that. In humans, we have that lovely system where if someone can leave their body to research, we don't have that set up in dogs. I've been involved in a number of efforts to try to get that set up, and none of them have actually really gotten their feet under them. I'm hopeful that that'll happen at some point, but it's quite challenging. That's sort of the landscape for where it goes after this particular paper.
So based on the findings, to what degree would you say behavior is genetic?
How do I even answer that question?
Right.
People ask me that question all the time, and it's hard to answer because there's not a straightforward answer to it. I think the best way of answering is that all behavior is genetic and no behavior is genetic. Genetics are always affecting your behavior, but so is environment. Often the way I come back when someone asks me a question like that is, Well, tell me exactly the situation that you're thinking of when you ask that question. So I work with a lot of dog trainers. A lot of times what they want to know is, if I have a dog with a behavioral problem, is it because some genetic switch was thrown in his brain and it cannot be fixed? And so we should not try to fix it. And the answer I always give is genetics is not going to tell you whether you can fix a behavior problem. Trying to fix the behavior problem tells you whether you can make progress on fixing the behavior problem. So go ahead and try. Genetics is never about a switch being flipped. It's always about little influences, little nudges. Here's another way I try to characterize it for people. It's a lot like looking at a weather system. Genetics is not good at saying this is exactly how the animal is going to be. Weather prediction is not good at saying 3 months from now, there's going to be a thunderstorm on this day. As you get closer and closer to it, as you know more and more about the animal, you might be better and better able to make some predictions about whether the animal will bite someone put into a specific position. But genetics really only tells you more about well, you live in Florida, so there's likely to be thunderstorms sometimes, or you live in Arizona, so you're less likely to have them. Genetics is just very bad at telling you with this particular individual, this is exactly what's going to happen. And so a lot of people want to say, well, certainly, Jessica, the reason that you want to do behavioral genetics is so that we can have a genetic test for behavior so that we can predict things about individual animals. And my answer is we are probably never, or at least no time soon, going to have an actual reliable test for predicting how a particular animal is going to behave. As much as we would love to be able to say, will this dog bite your child? I would like to know it ahead of time. Genetics is not going to tell you that. But what genetics can help us with is things like what I just said, saying that, oh, look, sociability turns out to actually have a fairly strong genetic component. And so we therefore can actually start making progress on breeding dogs who are more likely to have a really strong likelihood of liking people. And we may even be able to make genetic tests that say things like, if you breed these two dogs together, you're going to have a good likelihood of having puppies that are very sociable to people. And if you continue doing that for multiple generations, you will be even more likely to have puppies that are very social with people. But even so, how the puppy is actually raised and what the puppy's actual life experiences are still going to be very important. And there's still going to be other genes in the mix that you can't predict. It's just biology and messy.
Well, maybe we can't comment on one specific dog's behavior, but its population, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think of my own behavior as being my own. Maybe this is my naivete, but I don't think of it as something that's genetically driven. Is it something unique about dogs in this way, or do humans probably have some of their behavior determined in the same ways?
No, I think the one of the main differences between dogs and humans is that we have segregated dogs into breeds. And so we have these populations that are fairly homogeneous for certain traits, which makes them very interesting for geneticists to study. Humans are not so much like that. But no, I think that in the terms of a human and how much of their behavior is related to their genetics, I think it's probably fairly similar compared to dogs. I would say to you, are there not some things that you have always thought are part of who you are? And some things that you have that are similar to your parents. And I can't tell you whether those are actually genetic. You may be similar to your parents because of how they raised you. They may have raised you to be similar to them. And that is very important. But some of those things may also be that you've had little nudges from early on genetically pushing you in a particular direction. Your environment could have completely overwhelmed that and turned you away, even though your genetics were pushing you a certain way. But some of them will have had an effect. It's just hard to pick that apart from all of the environmental influences, the learning that you've had. Personality actually starts developing super early as not all that long after conception, definitely in the uterus. I had a friend in veterinary school who was pregnant with twins, and she told me that they had very different behaviors in the uterus that she could perceive based on how they responded when she got ultrasounded. She said that one of them would move towards the ultrasound probe. This is again in the uterus, and the other one would move away from it. She said that based on their position in her uterus, she knew which was which. So she knew which one came out first. So she knew which was which. And as they grew up, one of them had the more sort of exploratory, curious personality, and the other one had the more cautious personality. Is that genetics? Is that something that they started developing early on because one maybe had a bad experience with the ultrasound probe, and so early on that really affected how she perceived the world forever? I don't know, but genetics is just as likely to be part of it as experience.
I think there's certainly a lot of value in just basic science and research towards those ends, but do you see any avenues or where this research leads?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I mean, again, we talked about the Functional Dog Collaborative. And so my focus is very much on breeding dogs to fit well into their homes or whatever job they have. And so, and Carlson Lab has already been looking into working with guide dog groups in order to do that. So guide dog schools are already very much using advanced approaches to artificial selection, where they're doing a really good job of assessing the dogs and keeping deep pedigree records about the dog's behavior and then making intelligent breeding decisions based on that. And so one of the things that can be done with this information is to help them move forward faster. So one of the problems with doing that kind of selection without the benefit of genetics is that you may know very well what the sire and dam bring to the table, potentially based on other litters that they've produced. But what you don't know is when they come together and produce puppies, you don't know which of the puppies happens to get maybe a really big dose of genes pushing them in the direction you want, or maybe a really big dose of genes pushing them in the direction you don't want. So genetic testing could help a guide dog school do something like, say, with this litter of 8 puppies, we can see that genetically our best bets are these 4. So we're going to move forward with those. And the other 4 will go off to jobs that are more appropriate, being assistance dogs, which is a bit easier, or being pets, which is even easier. So that's one obvious application. And for me, I would love to see that in breeding pet dogs as well. And that's a ways off, but there's noise being made in some regions about let's try to figure this out for pet dogs. The other thing that behavioral genetics hopes to offer the world is a better understanding of how the brain works and of why we have the particular behavioral traits that we do. The GWAS that we did just gave us particular regions to drill farther into, but that is a very important first step. And then follow-up studies would drill into those regions, would find the causative mutation, would find the regulatory region, or eventually the gene. And then once you find the gene, you have a gene that you know is associated with sociability in some way. And to sort of clarify for those who don't have a solid genetics background, maybe coming into this, a gene provides the recipe for making a protein. That's what genes do. And what we don't always understand is what a particular protein's function is within a cell. And if we could say, well, we know that the hippocampus, for example, is a region of the brain that has a function in how quickly we recover after being stressed. So you hear a sharp noise and you jump, and then your hippocampus is the region of the brain that says, okay, no worries, it's all fine, time to settle down now. We would really like to be able to better understand exactly how that happens. How do the different cells in that region of the brain exactly function to send those signals? Why is it that some people can settle down faster and others not as quickly? Understanding the genetics of exactly how those things happen. And I'm using that example not completely at random, but because that's actually a relatively well understood genetic pathway where we pretty much do understand there's this particular protein that does this particular thing, but there's just many more functions in the brain that we'd really like to understand better at that level. Behavioral genetics points us to, here's a gene that codes for a protein, and that's a protein you want to look at and see exactly what it does in the brain so we can better understand how the brain works. Once we better understand how the brain works, we understand things like, what is this particular pathology? So once we understood that, we could answer questions like, if you look at a particular pathology, like, let's see, in humans, for example, anxiety. Are there different kinds of anxiety? If there are different kinds of anxiety, are they controlled by different biological processes? If they are controlled by different biological processes, maybe there are different medications that would be helpful. So right now, if you're a person who has anxiety or depression, you go into the doctor and you end up getting a prescription for a medication that may or may not help you. We're hopeful that it will help you. You take it for a while. You see if it helps. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, you try a different one. Medicine is moving towards what we call personalized medicine. The goal would be for someone to be able to get genetically tested and for us to be able to say, oh, we see you have a genetic risk for this particular kind of anxiety. So it seems likely that this particular medication is the one that will help you. So those are some kinds of approaches that we could hopefully start implementing based on research like this.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work. Can you tell listeners where online they can find more out about you and your organization? Oh, and your podcast.
Thank you so much, Kyle. This was so much fun. Yeah, so if anyone wants to find out more about the Functional Dog Collaborative, you can go to functionalbreeding.org. And that will have links to things like the podcast, as I suspect people who listen to this like podcasts. We also have a Facebook group. For those of you who don't want to commit to something like that, we have an Instagram and a TikTok feed. So those are all ways that you can start learning more about that. To learn more about me, you can go to dogzombie.com to get on my mailing list. And that would be a good way for you to find out where I'm going to be giving talks, because I do give online webinars mostly aimed at dog trainers. But if you are a dog person, you may be interested. And so there tend to be talks about things like the biology of behavior and the genetics of behavior and stuff like that. So thanks again. This was a blast.